WTO Accession and EU-Russia relations. So if you could please join me in a very, very warm welcome to Mr. Fraser Cameron.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks very much for the invitation. The EU-Russia Centre, you can Google up, is a NGO, and we carry out typical things of a think tank organising events with partners around Europe and Russia, publications and various reviews. We had on our board former President of Estonia, Thomas Ilves, and we worked very closely with colleagues in Estonia, Baltic states, Finland, in fact, many member states, and plus colleagues in Russia. This sounds like a very boring title, the impact of Russia's WTO accession on EU-Russia relations, but in fact, it's been a 17-year saga of negotiations for Russia to join the WTO. We hope Russia will ratify and finally join later this year, and then this will give a boost to, hopefully, to the negotiations for a new EU-Russia agreement. So what I want to do is just set a little bit the political background to this, go through very quickly some of the main aspects of the impact of WTO accession on EU-Russia relations, and close with some pointers to the future. So, surprise, surprise, Vladimir is back. What is this going to mean? I don't know what Mr. Melik says, but in my view, it's not going to mean a great deal of change in Russia, either in foreign policy or domestic policy. Why is this? I think it's because Putin has basically developed a closed system in Russia which benefits his friends and associates, and it would be too damaging to either go in for a full-scale modernization in Russia, and he is going to be constrained very much by the number one factor affecting the Russian economy, and that's the price of oil. So these are some of the parameters. Russia, as I said, will be joining WTO later this year. It wants to join the OECD, which is an economic think tank of industrialized countries, and on the 1st of July it takes over the chairmanship of the G20. So, it's the price of oil. This is the most important influence on the Russian political economic scene. Why? Because the Russian economy is so dependent on energy and the export of oil. And this is, I think, a distorting effect on Russia. It is quite comfortable to live off the proceeds of oil, but ultimately it's very damaging for Russia. Many Russian economists know this, but how you actually move from A to B has proved extremely difficult. And remember, when Putin came into office, late 1999, the price of oil was less than $35 a barrel. It's now $110 a barrel. And what has he done in these last 12 years to actually modernize the Russian economy and diversify away from oil and gas? And the answer is very, very little. He's also, I think, made a problem for himself in terms of the promises he made during the election campaign. Now, all politicians make promises. Not often are they kept when in office, but he did promise important supporters very large pay increases, promised indeed to double the budget of the military, but this can only actually work if the oil price increases above $110, or there'll be a real problem there. Foreign policy, I've just written an article about this on our website, so you can read it if you want, but I don't think there's going to be much change in foreign policy. Basically, Putin is a pragmatic nationalist. He doesn't like many people in America. He's got this anti-Americanism, which is quite common amongst foreign and security policy elites in Moscow. Doesn't like the European Union, doesn't really understand it, but he does recognize that the EU is the biggest market for Russian exports, particularly of oil and gas. Gazprom gets 75% of its profits from sales to the EU, 75% of the profits. So the EU is really pretty important for Russia. And the negotiations to renew the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which have been going on for the last 5 years now, have not really moved forward because of Russia not joining the WTO. Now there is a chance to move ahead. you'll see that Russia, every week, one or other leader talks about the need for more investment in Russia. Everybody knows that. But who in the right mind would want to invest in Russia, given the absence of the rule of law and the increasing corruption? It's not getting worse. Every single indicator shows that corruption is getting worse in Russia. And in all international indicators, you will see that Russia comes down very, very poor in terms of a business environment. Now, will this accession to the WTO improve this? Well, not on its own. It could help, but the impact of the WTO will, I think, only have a marginal effect, and much will depend on the implementation. Modernization, this has been a mantra, not just for the last, 5 years under Medvedev, although it became associated with him. It's been a mantra for several hundred years in Russia in terms of modernization. But how do you modernize when you don't have any rule of law, no independent judiciary, and a corruption that's getting worse? One of the worst cases of this was, as you all know, the case of Sergei Magnitsky. This is now having a political impact because there's a bill going through the United States Congress and the European Parliament to ban all officials associated with the murder of Magnitsky in prison from traveling to Europe or the United States. The customs union is one of the top priorities for Russia, but is this really the way to modernize Russia, associating with Kazakhstan and Belarus? You can offer your own opinions on that, but there are going to be problems there in terms of the tariff agreements that Russia tried to basically ensure that Kazakhstan and Belarus joined the WTO at the same time as Russia, but everyone said this was simply not possible. Kazakhstan hopes to join next year. Belarus is a long, long way off. It wants to join the OECD in the next couple of years. It will have to take on a lot more commitments to do that. You need to get agreement of all the countries in the OECD already to join that club. And at least one member, Japan, has made it quite clear that it would be opposed to Russia joining the OECD. Russia also wants ultimately an FTA, a free trade agreement with the EU, but this is simply not an option for the foreseeable future. Russia has also put a lot of its efforts into the BRICS. Russia was quite happy to be a member of the BRICS when it was started 4 or 5 years ago, but now I think it's really concerned about the dominance of China. And if you look at the latest summit in New Delhi, there was opposition to the BRICS starting a bank because everybody knew it would be financed by China and China would want to dominate the bank, and Russia was a bit concerned about this as well. The BRICS get quite a lot of publicity. The fact is there is no coherence between the BRICS on many, many issues. They are bound together by a loose concern about an alleged US dominance of the international scene. So overall, I think there's going to be rather little impact, but we're going to look now at the more details of a WTO accession. And the first one is tariffs. Russia has to agree to imply import duties at an agreed level of around 8%. So there'll be a reduction here in Russian tariffs. This makes hidden tariffs even more important. You probably know just now that Russia has banned the import of all live animals from the EU, and this is to protect Russian pig farmers. And the pretext for this ban is health grounds. They simply allege that pigs from Estonia or Poland are not up to standard, and therefore they simply ban them. This is a quite typical thing Russia has done when they have problems with other countries. They ban cheese from Romania and Bulgaria, they ban wine from Georgia, etc. Russia will not be able to do this when it joins the WTO, so they're actually doing quite a lot of this just now. They also have to scrap export duties on a number of areas. That's a couple of the most important ones there. This is potentially the biggest game changer service sector because Russia is poor in services in terms of banking, insurance, telecoms. They will have to open up these markets to foreign companies now, and this should see an improvement in the service sector in Russia. You'll see far more European banks, for example, being able to operate in Russia as well. The big problem is the state trading enterprises. And Gazprom is the biggest example of this. I mean, Gazprom is a monopoly, and Gazprom stroke Russia state sees problems in terms of the EU energy package and is subject to a European Commission investigation now for anti-monopoly practices. Domestic gas prices will have to increase in Russia as well. Now, do you know how much it costs if you want to get a job as a customs official, say on the border post at Narva between Russia and Estonia? You have to pay a bribe of $100,000. $100,000 to get that job, because you're expected that you'll make that income in 2 or 3 years working in that job.
Per month, yeah?
No, you have to pay 100,000 job to get the job, just to get the job. What do most young Russians want to be is a state official. I mean, it's just, I mean, not most countries, people don't want to become bureaucrats, but in Russia, lots of young people want to actually join the administration. There's been a huge boom in state employees over the last 10 years because they recognize that this is where you can actually make money through the corruption that's embedded into the system there. So tax authorities, border officials, very, very sought after jobs here. Russia will have to give up its subsidies on many products. Agricultural subsidies will be allowed up to a certain level, but lots of other subsidies will disappear, so some prices, including energy, will actually go up. Now here's the technical barriers to trade. I just said that Russia has been using this illegally in the views of the EU with regard to the import of animals from the EU. This now will have to be changed, and they will have to accept WTO rules, or the European Commission will take them to court. There's something called the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, and you're bound by that. So if Russia were to ban animals from the EU illegally without any scientific proof, the EU takes them to court in Geneva. There will be a ruling on that, and then Russia will have to accept that ruling. This is the sanitary and phytosanitary SPS measures. This is what Russia has been using at the moment. They're very open about it. Shekalov last week said, we only have a few months to defend Russia, he said, before WTO, and this is what's happening at the moment. Now, it should lead to more transparency in Russia's trade, because Russia will have to publish all details of its trade in every conceivable form to the WTO. The WTO will actually review Russian trade policy every 2 or 4 years, depending on how many complaints there are, and Russia can be held to account if there are any real infringements on the WTO commitments. There inevitably will be, but there will be no grace period as we gave China. When China joined in 2001, we basically said, okay, you've got such a long period of problems behind you, we'll give you a few years before we actually take any cases to the WTO, but this Russia will not have any grace period as we had with China. Now, what about the impact on EU-Russia relations? Overall, the accession of Russia to the WTO itself will not have a big impact. The negotiations for this new agreement, I call it PCA, but it's not going to be called that. We haven't actually agreed what the new agreement will be named. But it's been stuck for about 2 years, simply because you can't move forward on the trade aspect of the negotiations until Russia joins the WTO. So that's one big hurdle out of the way. The second one is energy. It's a big problem. Russia has signed but refuses to ratify the energy charter. And as I said, it's opposed to the EU energy package, which is in favor of liberalization of markets. And how do you accommodate a monopoly supplier like Gazprom in the European markets? So that's a big problem. You've still got problems in the neighborhood. Georgia, there's still unresolved issues relating to the conflict in 2008. The Swiss government negotiated a very good deal, and the details are still quite confidential, on how, when it comes to Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the trade affecting these two republics will be included in statistics that are passed to the Georgian authorities in Tbilisi. We'll see if that happens or not. But that unlocked the Georgian veto on Russia's membership of the WTO. Problems in Ukraine. Well, the EU has big problems with Ukraine. You probably know that Yulia Tymoshenko has gone on hunger strike at the moment, so politically it's very sensitive. Transnistria, Chancellor Merkel asked Medvedev some years ago at Merseburg, a nice castle outside of Berlin, to prove that Russia was serious about wanting to cooperate in foreign policy by working together on Transnistria. Well, it's 4 or 5 years now since that conversation and nothing has happened. So there's still problems there. And on human rights, Russia has a very sterile approach to the human rights dialogue, only allowing certain officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to take part. The European side wants NGOs to be involved, other ministries to be involved. The Russians refuse to do that. One slight sign of change is that we have agreed to establish a EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. And my organization, the EU-Russia Center, is one of the founding members of that. And this is going to work with Fedotov, who's the human rights advisor to Medvedev. Whether he keeps that job is another question or not. But we actually managed to get this into the official EU-Russia communique at the last summit, so it's been recognized as a positive step forward, along with the relationship between the public chamber and the European Committee of the Regions and Social and Economic Committee. That's another dialogue that's happening. But overall, there are still problems in terms of human rights in Russia, particularly how environmentalists are treated. One of the big problems is just simply the image. Ultimately, this agreement, if and when it's finalized, will have to be ratified by all 27 parliaments in the EU plus the European Parliament. And people will be voting on, basically the image of Russia. Is this a country we want to do business with? Is this a country we want to have a partnership with? And the image, I think, of Russia is not very good at the moment. Partnership for modernization, that's also not moving forward very fast. This, as I said, has been identified with Medvedev. Putin on paper is committed to it. But there are very different aims in this partnership. For the EU, we regard this as something that should be comprehensive, covering all aspects of society. For Russia, it's more or less making the status quo more effective, more efficient, without any real changes. Russia needs the EU for finance, for technical assistance, for investment, and they've identified a number of areas which they want help, both from the EU as such and also from member states. Many of the member states have their own individual partnerships with Russia, but in almost none of them has there been any significant progress. We have lots and lots of dialogues with Russia. Russia's the only country with whom we have 2 summits a year. We only have 1 summit with China, with America, for example. We have 2 with Russia. We have lots of ministerials. We have something called the 4 Common Spaces, dating back to 2003, where we're supposed to cooperate in different fields. We have lots of action plans as well. But the reality is that there's not been much progress in many areas. The whole relationship is called a strategic partnership. Nobody believes it is on either side, but it still has this title, simply because we talk past each other on so many different issues. So, just to wrap this up, I think it is important that Russia joins the WTO. After 17 years, it would have been scandalous if this had ended in failure. I think it should help transparency a little bit, but ultimately the real key is whether Russia follows through on the implementation of these commitments, and this then will have a bigger impact on different areas in Russia. It won't really have a big impact on the relationship as such. As I mentioned, it's not really a strategic partnership, because the future of this relationship really depends on internal changes in Russia. Is Russia going to be able to reform in a way that Europeans feel comfortable in dealing with this Russia, a Russia that doesn't, in the eyes of many Europeans, bully its neighbors, allows for more tolerant opposition inside Russia? And it'll be interesting to see what follow-up there is after the demonstrations following the Duma and the presidential elections. But another danger, I think, is also of a Russia that could be becoming more nationalistic in its approach. That would be a big danger as well. So the glass is, I think, probably, I'll drink some more, half empty rather than half full. Ultimately, this relationship will depend on how Putin takes Russia over the next 4 or 5 years, but there's nothing to suggest from the last decade that Putin is really going to make any fundamental changes in Russia, but I would love to be proved wrong. Let's take your questions now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this lecture. I think all of us are satisfied, but lots of questions.
Yep.
And I think our participants have many questions, as usual, and we're ready to start the question and answer session, so please, one will be first. Okay, you're welcome.
Yes, in your conclusion, you stated that for there to be real change in the Russia-EU relation, there would have to be internal change in Russia. But there are many IR specialists who believe that this type of institutional integration can ensure, through linkage, for example, can pave a way towards domestic change. So kind of the other way around. Do you believe that has some merit?
Well, that theory works when you are able to have some real leverage. The EU has real leverage with countries that want to join it. So when Poland or Estonia or Bulgaria want to join the European Union, we have a period of 5 to 10 years where we can basically say to these countries, you've got to reform not just your economic policies to meet the EU, but you have to change your political system, you have to introduce regions, you have to reform your police system, your judicial system, your border system. That's the time when we have leverage. We don't have that leverage on countries who don't see themselves as members of the European Union, including Russia. So our leverage with Russia, Ukraine, other countries is very, very limited. And the institutional linkages that we have are only affecting a tiny, tiny elite. Now, over time, one hopes that the informal contacts that take place through roundtables like this, through simply more and more Russians going abroad to work and study, and that's also a problem for Russia, that many bright young Russians are actually leaving the country to go and live and work in London, Frankfurt, Paris, New York, wherever, and not going back. So they're losing a lot of the talent that's necessary to actually bring about the reforms because they don't feel comfortable living there. They don't think that the system really gives the opportunity for their talents to be used, and that again has a negative consequences. More and more people actually start voting with their feet. So the theory works, as I say, when the EU is in a situation to have full leverage. It doesn't work in a situation where it's a normal bilateral relationship.
So you believe linkage cannot be effective if there is no leverage?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions? Yeah.
Yeah, on the same topic, basically, thank you very much for taking the time to see us today. I wanted to ask you on the consequences of the WTO accession. Do you think it will help in general with the demographic problem Russia is facing in the next few decades?
I don't honestly see any connection between that. I mean, the Russian demographic situation is caused by a poor health system, a poor diet. I mean, Russians are dying out. Why are Russians not having children? It's because they often don't see the environment being one in which they want to bring children. There are selfish reasons for not having children. It's a very complicated social issue. But the overall life expectancy for males in Russia is a scandal. It's only 60. And it's almost, third world standards. Women, it's a bit more. but it reflects badly on Russian society, the lack of adequate medical care there. And they do need immigrants to, and this is another problem, because where are these immigrants going to come from? They don't like taking immigrants even from parts of their own country, from the Caucasus, and they are worried about the rise of China and the implications. You've got 15 million Russians living in the Far East, and you've got 200 million Chinese just across the border. That is obviously a concern there. So it's not a very inviting society for immigrants. You get hardly any tourists going to Russia from Europe. You get hardly any European students going to Russia from Europe. And to me, that's a great shame, because they simply don't feel comfortable or inviting there. And that's why you get the whole flows the other way. You get 10 to 1 Russians going to study in Europe or the United States, and 20 to 1 tourists from Russia going to other countries as opposed to going to Russia. And that's bad. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. I was going to ask about change that is probable to happen in the Russian political system. You said that if this change will take place, then Russia-EU relations will probably develop in a more effective way. But what do you mean by change in political system? Do you imply that a more democratic political system should take place, a more liberal and open, or in which way should this change take place? Because basically, I don't believe that Russia can implement the same model of democracy as European Union or America, because it's just different mentality. So, if not democratic change, then what kind of change do you see can be probable in Russia?
I disagree with you. I mean, I don't think there's anything in the DNA of Russians that make them less democratic than, Brits or French or Estonians or Poles. I mean, you've seen, I think, a very encouraging sign that of the demonstrations after the December elections and the presidential elections, that Russians are not happy with the current manipulation of the political system. They want a say in their own future. It's quite natural. So I'm reasonably encouraged about what is going on in Russia in terms of the middle class awakening and wanting a say in their own lives. Yes, Russia should become more democratic, more liberal, more tolerant. Russia's a great civilization. Russia should feel more secure about its own society and condition. But unfortunately, for hundreds of years now, Russia has been badly governed by the Tsars, by the communists, and now Putin and his cronies. So I think it's really time that Russia had a genuine democratic government, but I'm making no apologies for saying that.
Just another part of the question, if the democratic change is to take place, how long do you think it will take? Because during the whole Russian history, which has thousands of years, there has been no change, no shift towards democratic society, whereas in Europe this development has been taking place for centuries. And now, maybe in 200 years it will be more good relations, better relations with the EU, or in which time frame do you think it will happen?
Well, firstly, we should be natural partners. We share the same continent, and we share so much in terms of history, culture, language, and so on. We have a lot in common. So, Russians are not, from some different planet. Secondly, how long will it take? I think, could come relatively quickly. I think more and more Russians are fed up with the political system now. I think perhaps if we move back to the regional governors being elected, that could be one way forward. I don't think Putin will win another term in office. There's a big debate even within the elite whether he should have stood this time round, because I think he's a handicap for change in Russia. Ultimately, Russians have to do this themselves. I mean, the EU or other countries can help at the margins by basically promoting contacts, supporting the training of judges and journalists and so on. But ultimately, this change has to be done by the Russians themselves.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Why do you think that there's no real physical modernization happening for such as infrastructure, like there is in China, for instance?
Because of the corruption. If you are trying to do something. I mean, a company came to me quite 6 months ago, a major Western company wanting to invest in Sochi and run up to the Olympics. They had to pay $500,000 to enter the tender process. When they were told by the chairman of the tender process, we can help you win this contract, but it will be $10 million to win the contract. They had no guarantee, of course, at this. And then they said, well, why are we getting into this? Because we know that even if we win the contract, more and more people will come and demand their $1 million or $10 million. So they just pulled out. And, you know, unless you're prepared to engage in corruption, you ain't going to really be able to master the system. So even big companies like BP have found this. Telenor, IKEA, I mean, the list goes on and on. They've pulled out because of the problems there. And why would you invest in Russia when there are other places to invest your money? The infrastructure is crumbling. I mean, you mentioned China. I mean, I go quite often to China as well as Russia, and the contrast is getting wider and wider. You know, you're gleaming new airports in China. You look at the state of the airports in Russia, look at the state, how many plane crashes there are, ships go down, the roads are in a terrible state. I mean, there's a lack of public investment. There's a lot of people getting very rich. Do you know what the Gini coefficient is that measures the discrepancy between the rich and the poor? It's one of the widest in the world in Russia. So you've got this small elite, you know, of multimillionaires and billionaires who drive around in their big SUVs and black windows so you can't see in, who have total disregard for normal people and the rule of law. And they are living in gated communities, you know, outside of Moscow, spending vast sums of money, also buying properties in London and Paris. It's a sick society when you don't keep your children in Russia or your money in Russia. The first thing you do when you make money in Russia is get it out of Russia. First thing you do, get it out of Russia. And the second thing, you educate your children at schools, in very expensive schools in England or Switzerland, and then send them to university outside. That's not a healthy society.
Yes.
I have a question about sustaining and the development of national champions in Russia economy.
Mm-hmm.
Does this pose a threat for the WTO implementation, or is this?
The state trading organizations are big in the Chinese economy as well as the Russian economy. They simply have to obey WTO rules. There's nothing against state trading organizations. You look at the way some major companies or banks have been essentially nationalized in Europe or America. This is not in itself a problem. It's a problem when you break the rules or you don't abide by the rules. For example, Gazprom is being accused of abusing its monopoly position by the European Commission, and hence there's a current case going against Gazprom in the EU and its subsidiaries there. So, as I say, state trading organizations as such are not the problem. It's how they're used.
Do you think that the Western world is beginning to accept that its model of democracy is not necessarily the hegemonic unilateral model for countries all over the world with different cultures, different societies?
No, I believe our model's much better than any other model, despite all the problems. I mean, you just look at, China. The Chinese leadership lives in a constant state of anxiety because they have no legitimacy. The legitimacy originally was communist ideology. Now that's disappeared. You go to China now and it's capitalism on speed. You know, Adam Smith would recognize the raw capitalism that you see everywhere in China today. So ideology is gone. You have the legitimacy based on economic performance. Now, so far in China, it's been relatively easy to bring about these high growth rates because they have a whole surplus of cheap labor coming from the countryside to the cities, and achieved a certain standard of living very quickly, thanks to being able to export principally to Europe and to the United States. That's all changing now. To move up to the next income level, you have to liberalize the economy, and that has political consequences, as we've seen in Taiwan, in South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, other countries who moved that jump. So that's what keeps the communist leadership awake in their beds at night in Beijing, not to mention the whole legitimacy question that's been thrown up by the Bojilai affair and the fact that, you know, someone who was groomed for the Politburo has been found, at least charged, with crimes relating to the murder of a British businessman. So in China, don't think China's a stable society. It's not. It's very unstable, and moving ahead is going to be really a problem. Putin, I don't think, sleeps all that comfortably in his bed too. Any dictator or authoritarian leader lacks legitimacy. Now, despite all the problems we've got in Europe, and despite, you know, the rise of populist forces, they're not dominant yet. You know, they're 10, maximum 20% in some societies. But next, you know, in 2 weeks' time, you have a clear contest between Hollande and Sarkozy, and whoever wins will be accepted as the president of France, having gone through this very open, transparent, democratic electoral campaign. That's where you get the legitimacy from. So I don't accept that authoritarian systems are better at delivering the goods than democratic systems. You can do it for a short period, but you also pay very high prices. I mean, if you're one of the 3 million Chinese people who were displaced because of the Yangtze, if your, you know, house was suddenly demolished because the local party official wanted to build a new block of flats, this happens all the time in China. And the Wuhan little village was a classic example of this, where the party officials have now just been charged and sent to jail yesterday, in fact. I mean, this is the reality of everyday life in China with no rule of law. So living in a society in Western Europe which does have the rule of law, does have independent courts, and does have democracy might not be, you know, a panacea, but it's much better than all the alternatives.
Okay. One more question?
Yes.
So, okay. One more question, because you mentioned legitimacy based on economic performance.
Yeah.
So why should the WTO accession actually trigger internal reforms if it will boost the economy and thus legitimacy of the current regime?
Well, it will boost the economy if it's implemented properly, and will help promote greater transparency in the rule of law, because Russia will then have international obligations. So you'll need to train Russian officials and lawyers to work within this new framework of the WTO. One of the big problems for Russia is that trade negotiations have been dealt with by a very small group of people in the Ministry of Economic Development, literally 20, 30 officials, a tiny group who moved around to deal with this negotiation, that negotiation. You'll need to have a far greater expansion of bureaucrats who understand the WTO. This will be developed into legal practices and consultants and economic operators operating within the WTO framework, because you've ultimately got a legal backup here, the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And this, hopefully, will have a knock-on effect to other sectors of the Russian economy, and also lead bureaucrats and hopefully politicians to understand that a rules-based system is preferable to an arbitrary system where you have political interference the whole time.
Thank you. And the last question was here. Does it have a question?
I don't know, because I was just going to come back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that I don't think that you could say that the presidents of Iraq and Afghanistan have any more legitimacy in the eyes of their people than say the leader of China. I don't, because those are failed democracies, because democracy is just not working in those countries. And do you think that we should keep pursuing that when there is no democratic foundation in the society and culture of those countries?
Well, that's a broader question. I mean, no, I don't think you can impose democracy in any country. I'm simply saying that democracy is the best political system that allows people to pursue their talents, that gives a perspective in terms of gender equality. There's no gender equality in Afghanistan. That allows people to express their views and not be locked up or imprisoned. These are all, I think, valuable gains that you have under democracy. It may not be, in the short term, the most efficient system for running the economy, but I think, taking everything into account, politics, economics, societal issues, democracy is the best political system. Now, I'm not saying that this has to be imposed. If other people prefer to live under a different system, that's fine. But I'm saying that I believe that democracy is pretty good. Basta.
Okay, very positive ending of our discussion. Democracy is good. So everyone is welcome to a coffee break, and after we have one more discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.